Hello and welcome to Stories Written and Read by Ballerscheff. If you'd like to listen along to the stories as I read them, then you can find a link to my blog in the description of this video. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. You're listening to Making the Rounds. His hands had a cold on them that wasn't coming off, no matter how much he rubbed them together. The cold drove him to shove his hands into his jacket pockets, and yet, had someone taken his hands in theirs and remarked how cold he was, he would have been surprised. She hadn't looked at her thermometer or opened the window and felt the air herself, so she couldn't have been the one to say that to him. Am I? He might have said in response. I didn't know. I don't feel cold. I suppose it just crept up on me and I got used to it. The sky was a bland gray with no foreground or background visible, as solidly gray as the night had been black. What she saw right in front of her was also what lay at arm's length, further from that point. The sky had been gray that morning too, and she was the type of person whose mood depended to a noticeable degree on the weather. She had found her way, once again, to the weekend. Saturday now gone, she asked herself what a day like Sunday could be good for. Today her sickness was at its worst. It was the first time since it began that she felt the need to call herself sick. At first, she'd thought she had simply slept badly and had begun to go to bed early to fix it. As her symptoms worsened, it had become easier to recognize them for what they were. She resolved to be thankful that her troubles had heaped themselves on this one day. They made each other more bearable together than they would have been if taken separately. When the day was over, they'd be over too. Had she awoken earlier than she did, she would have seen a pair of white clouds standing out from the gray they were set against. To her, that would have meant the sky would clear up sometime today. When she looked out now, there was nothing as promising as that out there to hold her interest. The man on the street had a frown on his face. The man on the street wore a frown so severe that it could be recognized as such even from where she stood. At a distance, she found that faces became indistinct if they weren't at the extremes of whatever emotion they expressed. As for him, his face tended towards the severe out of some aspect of his natural form, regardless of how he actually felt. She stood and stared at him, holding the whole street in her field of view, from the furthest corner of her one eye to the furthest and opposite corner of the other. The man looked around, first to one side of the street and then to the other side. He looked up at her house. His face was round and fat, with a neck that vanished beneath the rest of him. His jacket was tight around the shoulders. It was a size too small. The back stopped before it met his waist. He wasn't from here, she thought, curious. He couldn't be going door to door for donations. He had no collection box. The mailman had come Saturday. He had a build like the man on the street. That and their height made them alike in her mind, and that was all it took for her to confuse one, however briefly, for the other. It occurred to her that he could have seen her watching him. She looked straight ahead and pretended she hadn't singled him out among all there was to see. She knew her neighbors and knew that they would still be asleep at this hour, or if they had in fact gotten up by now, knew that they wouldn't be looking out the window anyway. This wasn't a gated community, although as a suburb it was separated from the other neighborhoods. For somebody new to come here on a day like this was a minor sensation, one it seemed she alone could appreciate. She turned her eyes his way again, watching him intently, and when it occurred to her that he might come here regularly, every Sunday even, if you could call his manner of dragging his feet walking, she watched him in the hopes of remembering the path he took, of walking it herself at the same time as him. That was how she would arrange to meet him and get an answer. It could be tomorrow if luck would have it and the weather and what else there was to stop her played along. Tomorrow, but not today. That would have been too sudden, and she'd rather stay inside. She watched him continue down the street and turn a corner slowly, at an angle that allowed her to see at least the back of him as he disappeared from view altogether. When he was no longer there to hold her interest, she did all that for which she ordinarily didn't have time, such as tidying the house and sorting through her mail. which she was accustomed to leave until the end of the week. Nothing bad had yet come of this, and so it was unlikely that she would change. She paid her bills on time and never missed anything that required her immediate attention, preferring to do that over the phone or by email if she could. The more she cleaned, the closer she looked at the house, and the more she saw that needed cleaning. She put aside her broom and handbrush and got the vacuum cleaner. When her house passed inspection, it came to her that she had yet to check her mail. Sorting through the contents of her mailbox, she set aside a letter from the local church inviting her to come by, though by now it was too late in the day to take them up on the offer. Underneath that was a coupon book, and none of the coupons she was happy to find had expired in the time she had left them in the mail. She picked her way through the coupon book, and writing a grocery list, counted up how much money she would have to spend to save a certain amount. Then there were the pamphlets for the candidates that were running for county council and for control of its assorted departments. Some of the pamphlets had come Monday, some Wednesday, and some Friday. She read them and was no surer than before of whom to vote into what position, or of what those positions meant. She wasn't sure she had ever heard of these people, though, with there being so many of them, she must have heard a name or two somewhere and forgotten about it. She compared them with the people she knew or had seen about town or in the neighborhood, and found no resemblance between them. She knew she wouldn't vote as surely as she knew she wouldn't go to church next week. There was time for her to change her mind, though she knew she wouldn't. She had never felt a pull towards any church, nor did she feel the pamphlets she read were motivation enough to vote. Still, she kept reading them, for the sake of something to do, her back to the window. The man trudged back the way he came, a resolute expression on his face. Had she stood at the far end of her window when the man was first coming round, and had she looked down the street to where it ended, she would have seen how he stopped at the last house in the street and put a pamphlet in the mailbox. Had her eyesight been a bit better, she could have seen what party colors his pamphlets were and found out who he worked for. She began to think about how to get him to come back, whether waiting was all it would take, and where to be when he came. The last of these uncertainties depended on the first two. As much as she tried, they couldn't be separated. As much as he'd been on her mind, they hadn't spoken. They had at most looked at each other when they'd each believed the other wouldn't see it. Should she stay inside again, the same thing would happen. She would have to spot him from the window, then hurry down to check the mail and meet him at the mailbox. What day that would be, if such a day was really coming, and what she would say to him, besides that she had seen him from her window and wondered what business he had here, all of that she didn't know. From time to time she glanced out of the window, and regardless of what she was doing, she kept her eyes in its general direction. Very little happened. Some children came out to play, then dispersed an hour later, and then the street was silent and empty. He must be on his return trip by now, she thought, or he's already made it home, and I've missed him. Tomorrow she would ask her neighbors about him. It was too late to ask them now, and 2 days, even if they had seen him, they'd have forgotten anyway. She would see him herself again, surely, sometime next week. That was Making the Rounds, written and read by Philip Ballerscheff. And again, if you'd like to read along to the recording as I read it, you can find a link to the stories that I keep on my blog in the description of this video. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you, and until next time.